watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I'm Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink. And this is the second episode in our series, X-Rated and Animated, The World of Ralph Bakshi, where we'll be digging into the work of a true and controversial auteur of animated cinema. Today we'll be discussing Bakshi's sophomore effort and his most autobiographical work, 1973's Heavy Traffic.
Ready or not, here it comes. The makers of Fritz the Cat now bring you Heavy Traffic. You'll meet hoods, hustlers, freaks, creeps, cops, crazies, weirdos, winos, hard hats, lowlifes, and God.
Hey, this is the voice of God. What's up?
It's animated, but it's not a cartoon. It's funny, but it's not a comedy. It's real. It's unreal. It's heavy. Heavy Traffic.
Heavy Traffic, written and directed by Ralph Bakshi, follows the life of a young man living in New York City named, not to be confused with The Godfather, Michael Corleone, who wanders around playing pinball and exploring the inner city, dark, grimy underside of the city. It's a really interesting film because it's kind of, as we mentioned before, Ralph Bakshi's most autobiographical work, but it also does a really interesting thing in that it combines some live action footage with an animated story and kind of bounce back and forth as they play off of each other as we see the real life in the live action and kind of this fantasy world that this young cartoonist creates in the animated world.
Yeah, some interesting techniques in this film, and as you said, this one is much more overtly personal than Fritz the Cat was. And this is a film that he originally wanted to make as his first feature, but of course he was not able to do that because who is this guy trying to make a personal animated feature? But once Fritz the Cat came out and was hugely successful and gained a lot of notoriety, he was able to make this film apparently very quickly after Fritz the Cat came out, because this is the very next year, 1973. Fritz the Cat came out in 72. And in this film, there's no more anthropomorphized animals. And this is actually Bakshi's personal favorite of the films that he made. And it's also one of his better reviewed movies, I would say. And what were your first impressions of it, though, Jeremy?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think that coming from Fritz the Cat, and to our listeners out there, for me, this is probably, I may have seen Fritz the Cat before, but for the rest of these Ralph Bakshi films, with the exception of maybe the Lord of the Rings film, this is probably my first time seeing all of them, so this was my first time watching this movie. Mm-hmm. And so coming from Fritz the Cat, like the anthropomorphized animals for me kind of put this little barrier up where maybe it could hit on some heavier, more risque topics and not quite feel as dangerous and brutal. Mm-hmm. Whereas this movie, I really felt that when things got dark in this movie, when things got intense, it was really, really intense.
Yeah.
I think that the fact that even though they're cartoon characters, the fact that we're watching human beings going through some of this stuff, the extreme violence, mm-hmm. the racism, the domestic abuse, it really kind of, for me, was a lot more brutal to watch. But because of that, I think also a more emotional experience. Mm-hmm. I found myself kind of really intensely invested in these characters mm-hmm. and their struggles as we move through this movie.
For sure. There is some disturbing and violent imagery in this film, and Bakshi appears to be wrestling with some inner demons and trying to expunge himself or expel these images from his head. With a lot of these animations, which I think is pretty different than Fritz the Cat. Fritz the Cat was more of it had a message, and he definitely was very, there's moments in there which are very out there and crazy and shocking and all of that. But like you said, Jeremy, because it is more real in a lot of ways and deals with real people, even though it's animated, it has a certain edge to it that Fritz doesn't really have, and it does give it that a little bit more emotion, as you said, as well. I definitely felt that from this movie, which mm-hmm. is why I think I do like it more than Fritz the Cat. But just to compare, it's apples and oranges kind of, because Fritz the Cat is completely different animal than this movie.
Literally.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't mean to do that, I swear. So this one, it's a lot more about inner city life, and I guess Bakshi's own background,
Mm-hmm.
growing up in New York. And as I said, it's much more personal. It goes into his parents, his family life, his career aspirations. A lot of the scenes in his the apartment that he grew up in is how he saw his parents.
Yeah.
And as you can see, maybe not the best view, or maybe just looking back, he was able to, like I said, I think he was working through some things with this movie, because to drive that point home, I mean, they're very cartoonishly arguing and fighting in every scene. His parents are, and they're clearly drawn from his views on how he saw his parents' relationship, I guess. And whether or not things like that happened in his home or not, I can't confirm. But I'm sure there's something that inspired him to look at it in that light.
Yeah. And I think the fact that it got so personal makes this film pretty relatable.
Mhm.
You know, despite the fact that there's this thing you hear people talk a lot. There is this thing you hear people talk about a lot, where they say that the more specific you make something as a creative person, kind of weirdly, the more it seems to resonate.
Mhm.
And I think that holds true here because, particularly for me, for the scenes with his parents and him trying to escape in his art, I think that's something that kind of anyone who is a creative person can relate to. Not
Yeah.
necessarily your parents being the source of stress, but kind of this idea of the art as escape, the
Mhm.
art as refuge. Um,
Yeah.
and
There's.
and I think that's the thing that makes the Michael character likable in this because he
Mhm.
does some pretty twisted things in this movie.
He does.
Just to get into the plot a little bit, he to quickly sum things up, he comes from this home where his parents are arguing, and he meets this local bartender who works at this very skeevy kind of bar. The two of them end up developing this relationship and then turning to crime.
Mhm.
To make some money. So
Mhm.
so Michael does some things in this movie that are kind of unsavory.
Yeah.
Um,
It's almost as if Bakshi was imagining a path that he could have gone on. You know what I mean?
yeah.
It's almost like he was like, well, things could have gone this way if I didn't find success in animation. That's the way
Yeah.
I kind of saw it.
Mhm.
But you as you mentioned, he's as a character, he is like, you look at him as like a sort of a very sympathetic character. There's even one of the scenes where his parents are arguing, and he's actually at a drawing board and animating a scene of his parents arguing, and as they violently come to blows in the background, he's actually animating the scene at the same time, which I thought was kind of interesting. And a lot of this movie can be seen as like a little on the nose, I guess, or like, oh, of course he made a movie about a young starving artist and blah blah
Mhm.
blah. But to me, that's where he was at this point in his life, and this is the movie that he first wanted to make, like I said, and it's something that he needed to get out of himself. And I think in the end, it is an entertaining movie, and I mean, there's different views you can have of it for sure, but you can't deny that there's a certain raw emotion to this film that is just really comes through.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that yeah, and I think that like we got into this idea of the like this violence kind of coming across, and it maybe being a little bit on the nose with him being an animator. I personally don't have a problem with that being on the nose. Because I think that the story of an animator isn't something that gets told a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yep.
Like even if it is on the nose, that feels kind of specific enough. Like obviously we've seen a lot of films about young filmmakers, a
Yeah.
lot of films about
Right.
young actors, and not to knock those. There's nothing
Mm-hmm.
wrong with those if they're done well, but that's where when we start talking about things being a little on the nose,
Mm-hmm.
like we have to present something new. And I think that this idea of the young animator is particularly interesting,
Mm-hmm.
especially in an animated film. It creates this kind of strange meta situation where you start watching it, and especially in this because we have that layer where there's also the live action stuff,
Yeah.
where you start
Which
really
we'll get
having to
into.
question, yeah, which you have to start really questioning how much of this is fantasy
Mm-hmm.
and how much of it is real and what the purpose of that fantasy is serving, because like generally a fantasy is when we put the things we want together. It's like you could see a fantasy being, oh, you become rich and you become famous, and or you become really rich, but or I already said rich, or but yeah. But I think what's interesting in this situation is that his fantasy is so dark.
Yeah.
His fantasy is not the kind of thing that most people would fantasize about. It's kind of
It's like ground level fantasy.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of like a Mulholland Drive, you know, and I
Mhm.
don't think saying that spoils Mulholland Drive at all, because you can't really spoil Mulholland Drive.
Well, we spoil everything on this show, so I
We
mean.
spoil everything, but once again, like, you know, that's just also when it comes to Mulholland Drive, it's just an interpretation.
Sure.
But it's kind of it revolves around this fear of failure, this fear of the underbelly of what it means to chase after the American dream.
Hmm.
Um, and I think to me that, like, even though it might be a little bit on the nose in terms of how it dives into his personal life, it's so personal, it's so unfiltered
Hmm.
that it avoids a lot of cliches. It avoids a lot of kind of getting lost in
Hmm.
its own, its own on the noseness, for lack of a better
Well,
term.
like you said, it may be a little bit on the nose. I keep saying that because I can't think of any other way to say it.
Yeah.
It
Hmm.
may be like that a little bit, but because the film is so grounded and down to earth in a lot of ways, even though it has these over exaggerations and over the top characterizations of different characters, it still has that gritty, down to earth feel, and I think that's kind of what makes it work. And I want to ask Jeremy, do you see this film? We discussed Fritz the Cat previously and how that was a commentary on 60s culture. Do you see this film as being somewhat critical or reflective on what was then the current 70s New York? Like the age they were living in? Do you think he was making a comment on the times they were in, or do you think it's more personal and that's about it? Do you think there was a little bit of both?
I think my feeling here is that just by setting it there and making something that's so personal, it inevitably becomes a comment
Mm-hmm.
on the time. And I think that that's something, it's kind of, no matter what time a creator is creating in, their work inevitably is a reflection of that time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are certain ideas, because there are certain things that if you were to put in a work of art now, they might be seen as regressive, where 30 years ago it would be daring and groundbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
If you're making a decision as a creative person, or Ralph Bakshi making these decisions as a creative person, to include, you know, the gritty gang violence, the domestic violence, the hypersexuality, all of that kind of stuff
Yeah.
in this film, and set it in New York City, I think inevitably, even if that might have just been his reality, there is an innate commentary on that place and that time.
Right. I think, but first and foremost, though, it was portraying the world as Bakshi saw it, or as it
Yeah.
appeared to him as a young man coming up in the streets, sort of, and trying to be an animator. And it may not be everyone's view, but then Bakshi is a very personal filmmaker, not someone who's really interested in mainstream opinions, I would say.
Yeah.
So I think his goal was always just to show his view of things and how he saw it. And the way he does that is he's never afraid to be crude or crass, I guess you could say, to prove a point. And probably a lot of that is what may turn certain people off from him and his work, as they may only see the surface level of what's going on.
He's not an easily accessible filmmaker, for
He's
sure.
not, and even though it's animation, and everyone says animation's for kids, whatever, he's dealing with some really deep-seated issues and some complicated themes. And some people just see, it's a cartoon, and they don't really pay attention, or they just think it's stupid and whatever. But I do believe that there are deeper currents at play here and more complex themes at work if one is open-minded enough to look for them. And also, along with that, Bakshi does not shy away from racial and ethnic stereotypes, a lot of times using them to explore racism or certain attitudes of the time. As you said, when you make a film, it's of its time, no matter what you do, really. And there's certainly a lot of that here. And seen through a modern lens, it can be seen as maybe problematic or unwarranted. Seems like Bakshi allows his mind to freely explore these types of themes in his animation. But how do you feel about how those types of things were represented here? Do you think because Bakshi lived in that world, do you think it's maybe more acceptable, or you can see where he's coming from? Or how do you feel about the stereotypes and the racial, I guess, themes of this film?
I personally feel that with Bakshi, once again, as we discussed in our Fritz the Cat episode, there's a certain thing where, because he's kind of from these actual situations and environments, he's not guessing at what these people's lives are like. He's kind of really experienced it. I think that those decisions are done in kind of a place where he's trying to make a statement about it, particularly when it comes to race, because that seems to be the thing in his films that often gets talked about as the most controversial thing. I think, in my opinion, and I could be wrong, this is just an opinion,
Right.
but I think he's using kind of stereotypical drawings and imagery to as satire almost. He's trying to make a point that this is the worldview, and by accentuating and not just like every race and type of people are kind of the thing about them that is considered the most stereotyped is always brought to the forefront. It's accentuated. So to me, I think he's kind of using that as a tool.
And as you said in our previous episode, he is an equal opportunity offender. I think that's
Yeah.
your exact words because I was just
Destroyer.
editing it. Oh, destroyer. Sorry.
Yeah, equal opportunity
I got
destroyer.
it wrong. But yeah, you had mentioned that, and I think that's very true because I think everyone gets it in certain ways. And a lot of these people he did, these types of people he did know and grew up amongst them. And as we also discussed in the previous episode, he's a very ground level guy. He would take a tape recorder and go to a bar and talk to people and get their actual conversations and record those and put them into his movies. So I think he comes from it from a different place than a lot of other people would, which maybe gives him certain leverage. And I think he's dealing with things that he's seen and conversations that he's heard and things like that. So, but there, sorry, what was that?
Sorry, well, I think he tends to give, even if he draws someone, a particular character, in a really stereotypical way, he tends to humanize those characters too.
Yeah, you tend to feel sorry for them, or
or like they're not one-dimensional stereotypes.
No.
Even if they're drawn, even if they're drawn in a way where, and I think that's kind of what's interesting too, is why I would personally lean towards saying that he's doing this in the spirit of satire, is that if someone is drawn in a way where you have a preconceived notion about them, he will kind of immediately break the preconceived notion. Which is interesting because historically, animation has a huge history of racism. Historically, like if you look back at early animation, like it's it's rampant with really, really racist, troubling imagery, and those characters were never portrayed as three-dimensional human beings. They were just the stereotype. So I think by drawing these characters as a stereotype and leading you to believe that it's going to be a certain way, and then all of a sudden flipping that and portraying this very real human being, it kind of makes us as the audience really think about and consider why that decision might be made and what's being accomplished.
For sure. Yeah, I think it's not surface level, I don't think. And in addition to him exploring those types of themes, he also, this film, Fritz the Cat, was, I would say, a complete satire. This film has elements of satire in it, and he does explore the animation world a little bit, not too much, but there is a scene in particular I wanted to talk about because I think it's kind of sums up his feelings maybe about the animation industry. But so Michael, the main character, gets a chance to pitch a comic strip idea to an old executive, and this guy is literally lying on his deathbed in the hospital, but he seems enthusiastic enough to listen to him explain the idea. And once Michael has gone on this little tangent and explained what he wants to portray, the tone of it is, I guess, so dark that the mogul actually ends up dying during the pitch. So it's like, I feel like that says a lot about how Bakshi felt at this time, when he was probably pitching this idea, honestly, to some old executive who had no idea, like, what is this? Like, you're going to make an animated film for adults? And he had proven that he could do it with Fritz the Cat, but before that, I'm sure it was, and even after Fritz the Cat, I'm sure it was difficult for him to get anything made, which is why I was so surprised that this was made so quickly. I guess because that movie was so successful. But anyway,
and this movie too was made. This wasn't an expensive movie to make. Like I can't verify these numbers, but the numbers I'm seeing in terms of budget are $950,000.
Okay.
which, granted this is early 70s, so that wasn't like nothing
Yeah.
back then, but it wasn't a big budget movie, especially for a director and writer coming off a movie that
Hmm.
just made $90 million,
Yeah.
and saying he's going to do something in a similar style with similar themes. Like no one wrote him just a massive, he didn't have a blank check to make this movie.
Yeah,
um,
and he did run into a lot of problems during the production of this film. I was reading
mhm,
about that a little bit as well. I don't know if you saw that, Jeremy, but halfway into production, Bakshi was actually fired.
right.
He was eventually rehired, obviously, but they were trying to get a different animator to actually finish the film, which I can't even imagine because
Yeah.
he is such an auteur and he oversees every cell of a film. So they, I don't know if this is just a rumor. I saw it listed a couple places, but it's unbelievable to me that they would do this. But apparently, they tried to hire Chuck Jones to finish directing this film. Like the guy who worked on a lot of Looney Tunes and things like that, which
Hmm.
I mean, very talented man, obviously, but it's just such a
Would have
different
been.
thing. I
Yeah.
mean, it's yeah, he declined it, and I again, Bakshi ended up coming back, and everything ended up working out. But
Yeah.
that is just very interesting to me if that's actually true, because yeah, Bakshi's just his own style. He's an auteur for
Yeah.
sure, and yeah, to see anyone else try to take on his work would have been interesting, but
Yeah.
not the same movie.
So speaking of style, as you just mentioned, he has his own style. One stylistic note that is significant about this particular film is Bakshi's use of rotoscoping,
Yep.
where he kind of, not as much as in his later work, but here he really started to introduce some of the rotoscoping, which I don't totally understand the technology of rotoscoping.
Hmm.
Mark, you might be able to speak to it better.
Well, I don't understand the ins and outs really, but I
Yeah.
know that it basically involves uh, drawing over a real footage, real
Mhm.
person, and using that as your guide for the animation, pretty much. Instead of either going off the top of your head or looking at a
Mhm.
reference, they would actually trace over real footage, which would
Yeah.
give it a much more realistic motion.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that as the director and writer who working in the animation field kind of seem most concerned with realism, that this is the technique that he would end up embracing.
Yeah, you see a
Because
lot of it in his Lord of the Rings that he
in just
eventually
Lord of the
makes.
Rings, yeah,
Yeah,
I think I might be wrong, but wasn't it like most of that movie? I think was
yeah,
rotoscope,
most if not
um,
all. Yeah.
which is crazy. I would love to see the original footage, but
I think it does exist somewhere.
it has to exist
Yeah,
somewhere. But we'll get to that when we get to that movie. But I do think it's interesting because you kind of wonder maybe why, if he's already taking the step to rotoscope. One thing I was thinking about is like there was more money not to be made, but bigger budgets in making live action films, and at this time a film like Heavy Traffic probably could have gotten made as a live action film.
yeah.
This
Low
is
budget.
within,
Yeah,
yeah, low budget, kind of similar. I'd have to check the dates, but similar time period to, like, well, actually, yeah, same year as Mean Streets came
yeah,
out.
yeah.
So I almost wonder, like I wonder if there was ever for Bakshi a temptation to just say, all right, screw it, I'm gonna go do this live action thing,
Well,
uh,
yeah. I
or if
mean,
it was always about the animation.
yeah. It's a good question. He's such an animator at heart that I couldn't imagine it any other way. But I guess he was trying to expand his horizons a little bit and maybe
Yeah.
just experimenting because there's lots of experimentation, as you mentioned.
Hmm.
There's a very experimental nature with this film, so they combine live action with animation, sometimes even in the same exact frame, which is really cool and
Yeah.
something you didn't see much at that time. Until Who Framed Roger Rabbit and
Hmm.
Aha, the music video for Take on Me, until those things started coming out
Right.
and blowing people's minds.
Yeah.
So this was before all of that, and he was just kind of trying it out, I guess, and trying different things. And sometimes it comes off really neat, and there's some cool effects with that. He also incorporates scenes from old movies and war footage. He also incorporates what looks like B-roll footage or images for the backgrounds. As we discussed with Fritz the Cat, they used actual photographs of backgrounds, and they traced over that for the backgrounds in that film. And in this film, they kind of took it a step further, where they would actually use the actual footage or the photographs as the background, and they did some tracing in this film as well. So he kind of combines a lot of different elements, and it's a natural progression, I would say, from Fritz the Cat. and you see him trying out a lot of different things in this movie, and that's part of why I like this movie so much, because it's so much you just feel his energy, you feel his headspace so much when you're watching this. You just see him trying out these different things, and so I thought that was pretty cool. I did want to ask, because there are some actual live action scenes in the movie, mostly the ending. How did you feel about the beginning and the end? What did you think of the live action segments? Do you think they worked? Do you think they fit well or mixed well with what we saw in the rest of the film?
I think they worked. It kind of took me by surprise a little bit. I think by the end of the film, when we see some more of this live action footage, I had kind of forgotten the beginning a little bit.
Yeah.
I had kind of forgotten that we had already seen the live action stuff.
Yeah.
So to me, it kind of felt like it came out of nowhere a little bit. I love, once again, spoilers abound. I love that we have our main character getting killed.
Yeah.
And then we go to our live action thing. Yeah. I'm like, wow, like they're killing the main character. Where does it go from here? So like I thought that it was a natural conclusion. Yeah. I think it was kind of jarring for me personally for the first like minute of that live action footage.
Right.
Like it took me a little while. It didn't seem like necessarily like a smooth.
It almost felt
transition.
Like they were gonna go right back into animation. They didn't at all.
Yeah.
Which because I had seen this years ago and I had forgotten that there was so much live action in it. To be honest, I didn't really remember that, so it took me by surprise as well. Even rewatching it, and but I think it works. I think because the movie is so ground level and real in certain ways, I think it makes sense to end on an actual live action scene. Whether or not it works as well as everything else in the movie, I mean, that's up for debate. But I think it's the fact that he ended it that way is interesting. And you see where his headspace was at. And another thing I wanted to discuss, besides the live action footage, there's a reoccurring motif of pinball in the movie. Yeah. I wanted to talk about that a little bit. I guess I saw it as Bakshi seeing inner city life as some sort of win or lose game.
Interesting.
Yeah.
No, go on. I'm curious to hear this.
Well, that was my main thought about it, just how people...
Like a win or lose.
Yeah, and people ping-ponging back and forth and never really, and then, I don't know, just like seeing it as a game was an interesting motif that went throughout. But
because I had an interpretation of that too, and for me it was kind of because the main character was the one who we saw playing the pinball, not pinball, that combined ping pong and pinball. Because the main character was the one we saw playing pinball, I kind of thought of it in relation to him. And the thing about pinball is that it's all about this ball getting knocked around kind of recklessly. Yeah. It's all about this thing where it gets hit and it's going in a direction, but it hits something and then it's thrown in another direction. It's just kind of getting pushed around with no real will of its own. And I thought that was kind of the perfect metaphor for the Michael character, because he basically would just kind of roll with the punches throughout this film. Yeah. It didn't really seem like he had a lot of agency. Like, he's just thrown into an environment and then shot out and then just kind of getting pushed around by these people and circumstances, even from the beginning. Like, you look at his family life, like, he kind of had no chance based on the situation he was coming from. His parents couldn't really nurture him or give him any guidance because they didn't really seem to have their own.
Yeah, it's like he's banging around inside that apartment, and then he ends up out in the streets, and he's banging around outside there.
And eventually it ends up with him, going, I don't know the terms for pinball, but going down the gutter. Is that what you would say?
Whatever.
I don't know. Whatever it is when you lose pinball.
Exactly.
Whatever it is when you lose. But eventually he loses, he gets knocked around until there's nowhere else for him to go, and he can't get knocked around anymore, and then it's game over.
Right. Game over, exactly.
So
and the metaphor comes through in really interesting ways. Like, there's one scene where, and this may even just be me putting my own thoughts into it, but at one point a gun is fired, and as the bullet comes toward us, or towards where the quote-unquote camera would be, it resembles a big silver pinball.
Interesting.
But it kind of morphs.
That's a good catch.
From that into a bullet, and so that's one way that he explores that theme. And obviously the live action segments in the beginning and the end show the main character playing pinball. And I did look up, because I was interested in, why he chose that theme, and I saw some information about it. Apparently the inspiration for the film actually came from penny arcades, where Bakshi would often spend his time playing pinball and sometimes bringing his 12-year-old son, Mark, with him. So he wanted to use it as a metaphor to examine the ways of the world. So that makes sense in that regard. And
What's interesting is this is actually, now that I'm thinking of it, this is the second pinball movie we have talked about
oh, it is.
on this
You're
podcast.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you get the chance, go back. If you've not listened already, go back and check out our episode on Tommy in our Rock and Reel series.
Yes.
But it's kind of a similar thing, actually, where they use the metaphor in a similar way. What year was Tommy? Was Tommy 1970? It was 75. So
75, yeah.
this actually predated Tommy. I don't know if,
Well,
you
the
know.
album came out, I think, early.
Yeah, it is. So which, and I think it's also just one of those zeitgeist things
I think
where it's a
pinball was
game.
really very much in the
It was very popular, but it's interesting kind of seeing this pinball metaphor being used twice in a kind of similar way, actually.
Yeah.
You know, this young person who's thrown into a really crazy, violent, scary world, and forced to navigate it with no real guidance, just
One
kind
of
of
them
being
who-
bounced around.
one of them who achieves fame, and this one who doesn't. So it's
Who
interesting
doesn't,
that
yeah.
way. Yeah.
Who kind of goes in the exact. And what's interesting too is to go back and once again sort of briefly, because we already did a whole episode on it, so please go back and listen. But Tommy follows the story of a deaf, dumb, blind kid who plays a mean pinball. And basically in that story, he has no real agency. He kind of just, because he's so good at pinball, but he can't see, can't hear or anything like that, he becomes very famous for it. But it's kind of almost like the Forrest Gump thing, where it's this guy who's not really trying
Yeah.
to achieve great success or fame, just kind of does. Whereas in this story, it's this guy who really desperately
He's
wants
struggling,
something
yeah.
else and is struggling, but despite his best efforts, isn't able to, which is really a pretty interesting and grim worldview.
Yeah.
But also, obviously, a realistic worldview. You know, there are plenty of stories in real life and in fiction that we hear of people who, despite their best efforts, just don't get where they want, and then they either spend their lives miserable or they have to reckon with it and try to pick themselves up and do something else, or just kind of keep trying. I mean, you hear stories about people like I'm a big rock and roll fan, and there's this documentary about a band called Anvil. Have you seen that, Mark? Or heard of this?
I have heard of it.
Basically, they were a band that started out, I want to say, it's been a really long time since I've seen it, but they started out back in the 70s or 80s
Yeah.
and kind of just kept playing music and have been playing like small clubs to nobody for years, like 30, 40 years. And eventually this documentary filmmaker found them and made this film about them, and now in their probably 60s are for the first time really having some success.
Oh wow.
So it's, you know, it's one of those things where
You never
you
know.
know, you never know, but the stories about people who are really driven are kind of
Yeah.
interesting to dive into, because you see the different ways that
sure.
luck plays into it.
Yeah.
You see how the one opinion of the guy laying on his deathbed, who's the executive, can totally change someone's view of themselves,
Or make and
and
break you as a
make or break you. Yeah.
as a career. Yeah.
Um,
What did you think about the soundtrack for this movie? Being a rock fan, there's a lot of like I think rock music that he used from
Yeah.
the time. Maybe not rock and like. Well, I guess there was some like traditional rock songs actually that he used in there.
yeah, Maybelline,
some
Scarborough
older stuff,
Fair, yeah,
Yeah.
Twist and Shout.
Yeah.
No, I really enjoyed the soundtrack for this. Weirdly, the song that kind of stuck with me from this movie was Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck
Yeah.
Quartet. And that is for a personal reason, because I used to work in an office building where someone would stand outside and play that song over and over again for money. So every time I hear
wow.
that song, I am immediately enraged. But no, I thought the soundtrack was great. I think it's kind of the time, you know, like
Yeah.
perfect. A few years after The Graduate, you know, you're like you have this idea of The Graduate, Easy Rider. You know, that was very
Yeah.
timely to be using contemporary music then.
Right. But it still has
which-
that kind of like funky score that Fritz the Cat had, where it's like kind of like this background music to a lot of the scenes as well, like like a more funk oriented music, I guess.
Which I think relates to that idea of like the penny arcades, because I feel like that's kind of maybe the music that you would hear people like you're standing around in the arcade.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I wasn't around in the late 1960s playing pinball, but at least in my mind, that kind of instrumental funky stuff is what would accompany a day of pinball and smoking cigarettes outside with your friends.
Yeah, and it gives the whole movie a certain kind of feel, I think, when you put that kind of music in the background. And so, I guess to kind of close our conversation on the movie, I wanted to bring up that, you know, we talked about how Fritz the Cat was a X-rated film and how that was such a big deal at the time. This one was also rated X, because they, as much as the producer Krantz and Bakshi wanted to go for an R-rated film because more people could see it, they still were given an X-rated.
Although eventually an R-rated version was released in the late 1990s,
Okay.
which I'm not sure why, but
Oh, was it? Okay, I actually didn't know about that. Was it an edited version of the film?
I would
was it-
imagine. I don't know. I'm seeing one of my notes here about that, but
Yeah.
I don't know. That seems like maybe a late 90s independent film was really popular. Let's just
Yeah.
quickly take advantage of this
Right.
lesser known animator who
Uh-huh.
Quentin Tarantino and Paul Thomas Anderson have probably talked about or something like that.
Probably, yeah. And I know when they were making the film, there actually was alternate scenes and alternate animations made to try to, I guess, decrease some of the seedier moments. I guess they tried to make it a little more R-rated friendly. But yeah, in the end, it was given an X rating. But the film is considered to be Bakshi's biggest critical success. So despite all that, and I wanted to read a couple quotes here because I think it sums up the movie pretty well and a lot of people's thoughts on it. So Newsweek wrote that the film contained black humor, powerful grotesquerie, and peculiar raw beauty. Episodes of violence and sexuality are both explicit and parodies of flesh and blood porn, a celebration of urban decay, which I think describes it pretty well. And then also, New York Times, Roger Greenspun wrote in 1973, people who felt that his earlier feature, Fritz the Cat, merely debased a cherished original can now judge Bakshi's development of his own material. I think that development is as brilliant as anything in recent movies, as brilliant and in its own improbable way, as lovely and as sad. And I think that's pretty good at summing up how you feel when you watch this movie. It's funny, it's sad, it's off the wall, it's raw, as many
a little bit of
films are.
everything.
Got a little bit of everything. It's offensive. It's everything, and a lot to dig into. And this is still just the beginning, the early stages of our journey with Bakshi, though, because we're going to get into some more epic material. We are not going to do an episode on Lord of the Rings, I believe. We're going to discuss it a little bit along with a fantasy film that he created himself, a story that he originated called Wizards. That's going to be our next film that we're going to discuss, and there's a lot to discuss there. So we're going to end it for Heavy Traffic right now, and thanks for listening to Cult Movie Cult. You can find us on iTunes, Podbean, and Spotify, as well as on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, or if you'd like to officially join the cult and be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.